My name is Drew Johnson. I'm a student at Webster University, and we'll be examining the fact and the fiction surrounding Palestrina and the Council of Trent. The persistence of the legend of Palestrina and the Council of Trent, despite its fictionalization of history, demonstrates the power and excellence of Palestrina and his masterpiece, Missa Papa Mercelli. In our examination, we will first look at the facts that lay the foundation for the rise of the legend. Next, we will look at the fiction that gave birth to the legend. And lastly, we will look at what fastened the two together. The legend has been passed along from generation to generation for over 4 centuries. There are many iterations, but they all go something like this. In 1562, the fate of liturgical music was in great peril. Those that sat on the council insisted the interweaving, overlapping melodies common to polyphony created music so complex that the text was unintelligible. Therefore, since the congregation was unable to understand the words, the music served no purpose except to entertain and tickle the ears. As a result, the council was dead set on completely banning music from the church. Many who learned of the council's intentions were horrified by the idea of a church without music. One of the many that were horrified was Palestrina himself. Palestrina knew he could compose a polyphonic mass that allowed all the words to be understood without compromising the beauty of the counterpoint. And he did just that. The mass was entitled Missa Papa Mercelli. When it was performed for the council, they were overwhelmed by its beauty and amazed by the fact that they could indeed understand the words. After the performance, the council turned from its evil intention to ban music from the church, and Palestrina was the hero who had single-handedly saved music forever. In recent decades, musicologists have determined this story to be largely false. Alas, our hero Palestrina never really saved the fair maiden polyphony from the cruel council. Instead, Palestrina was possibly one of many factors that led to the council's decision to not rule against polyphonic music. Nevertheless, though the legend is mostly fiction, the way the story was embellished over the centuries does provide a window to the interesting truths behind the legend. Palestrina lived during a time of great turmoil in the church. The Protestant Reformation had been a serious menace to the Catholic Church and put its survival in jeopardy. For this reason, many Catholic leaders sought to return to tradition and reestablish orthodoxy. For years leading up to the council, there were growing concerns about the deteriorating state of music in the provincial churches. In the eyes of many, the purpose and use of music in the church had wandered far astray into a place they believed was irreverent and sinful. While this is true, music was not high on the list of issues to be addressed by the council. They had far more important issues to deal with, and having a proper view of where music fits into the puzzle of the Council of Trent is critical in separating the fact from the fiction surrounding the legend. For example, consider the official decree released following the 22nd session, one of 2 primary sessions that dealt with music. The decree said, "Let them keep away from the churches compositions in which there is an intermingling of the lascivious or impure, whether by instrument or voice." That's it. A single sentence. In order to understand how the council arrived at such a benign statement, we must consider the process that often preceded the release of a final decree. Typically, subcommittees were formed and tasked with hammering out the details of various issues before bringing them to the full council for a formal vote. At times, the subcommittees would draft a preliminary decree to bring to the council that would then be further edited by the council before arriving at a final vote. Musicologist Craig Monson stresses the critical importance of distinguishing between what was in the preliminary decree and what was in the final decree, because a failure to make this distinction is the source of much of the misinformation surrounding Trent and Palestrina. For instance, this is the preliminary decree on music from the 22nd session. You don't have to read it, just look at the difference between this and the final decree. The preliminary decree and the final decree often bore little resemblance to one another, a fact we will further explore later. The following year, in the preliminary discussions leading up to the 24th session, the issue of music was raised again, presumably because some of the members of the council were unhappy with the decree following the 22nd session that said little about it. A preliminary copy of the discussion topics from the 24th session was sent in a letter to Ferdinand I, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. There is little information on what the council's letter said about music other than a portion of the letter that Ferdinand quotes in his reply. In that section, there is no suggestion that the council intended to ban polyphony. However, in his reply to the council, Ferdinand refused to remove polyphony from the church. Did Ferdinand simply overreact and misinterpret the council's intentions? It's quite possible that he did. This is a significant point to consider because Ferdinand's letter has repeatedly been used to reinforce the claim that the council intended to ban polyphony, which they quite likely did not. The decree following the 24th session ironically said even less about music than the 22nd session had. The council once again chose not to make any declaration on the issue of textual intelligibility. Indeed, there are many musicians and musicologists who helped shape the legend over the centuries. However, we will only look at three of the most notable contributors. First is Agostino Agazzari. Agazzari wrote the first known instance of Palestrina being depicted as a savior of music in 1607, only 13 years after Palestrina's death. He claimed that Palestrina composed Missa Papa Mercelli to demonstrate to the Pope, who was threatening to ban music, that polyphonic music could indeed be composed that allowed the text to be intelligible. Thus, the seed of the legend was planted. Next up is Giuseppe Baini, who wrote the first biography of Palestrina. His account reads more like a fairy tale than history and is almost comical at times in its highly dramatic style. Baini claims that Palestrina was commissioned by a cardinal to write a mass that met the requirements set forth at Trent. If he failed, well, here's how Baini put it. Poor Pierluigi was placed in the hardest straits of his career. The fate of church music hung from his pen, and so did his own career at the height of his fame. Of course, in Baini's tale, Palestrina succeeded. For well over a century, Baini's book would reign supreme as the most mistaken account of the Palestrina legend. However, his reign would come to an end in 1954 with the publishing of American musicologist Gustav Ries's Music in the Renaissance. Ries would further confuse the facts of the Council of Trent, not with a misuse of dramatization as Baini had done, but with a mishandling of documentation. In his book, Ries presented the following paragraph as being the final decree from the 22nd session of the Council, a decree that has already been established as one sentence long. Ries's decision to combine what comes before the ellipses with what comes after was possibly the biggest gaffe in all the scholarship surrounding Palestrina. Despite Ries's assertion to the contrary, nothing before the ellipses in this paragraph was in the final decree by the council. Ries unknowingly took a paragraph from a preliminary decree and placed it at the beginning of the actual decree, which was a single sentence long. Monson points out that the ellipses in Ries's extensive quotation in fact covers a week's debate at Trent. Now, having examined the fact and the fiction, it is important to acknowledge the glue that fastened the two together. Palestrina was so highly regarded by musicians, musicologists, and laymen alike that people were susceptible to believing fictional tales about him that made him larger than life. In addition, Missa Papa Mercelli does seem to fulfill the requirements set forth in the legend. The text is clear, it is solemn, it is beautiful, it is unquestionably amazing. The establishment of the legend as fiction in no way reduces the greatness of Palestrina. This study, in fact, aimed to bolster the perception that he was an exceptional talent who was immeasurably influential. If he had not been so, the legend would never have come to life, nor would it have survived for well over 4 centuries. Further scholarship can only serve to grow one's admiration of Palestrina.